So this is the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and our experience over the last 10 years. So I'm really trying to address some of the issues around how you get the message across. All of us, and you are also working in very complex information, and we live in a world of fast-paced communication where we're trying to get our point across, capture the imagination of many audiences and many stakeholders, convey our message quickly, but also to stay on the side, it's complex. And if we simplify things to mush, we're in trouble. So it's that balance between conveying the message simply with clarity and yet getting the point across there's something more to say and having a conversation about the complexity of the world we live in. This is really, at the end of the day, what we measure our well-being on. Is the GDP going up? Is the TSX going up? And even though there was a window of opportunity, a sad window of opportunity when we had the recession last September, where there was a bit of a disequilibrium, and people like Obama, people like Stiglitz, who put in their commission work, that there was an opportunity for a re-dialogue about what really constitutes well-being. A great opportunity, but as you can see, we're starting to shift back to the GDP. You know, we're talking now again about the GDP as opposed to all those other issues that relate to sustainability and not just specifically the economy. So just showing you this is sort of an example of how we very quickly give an understanding of what we're really using and how important it is to find and capture ways of sharing how we look at well-being now and find new ways of identifying and visualizing that. I've just put up here, and you've probably all read it. You probably know it by heart. Yes? Stiglitz Commission. I think there's some interesting things in here, and I'm showing it because I think there's something underlying about values, about the relationship between measurement and trend, about the relationship between what we want to achieve and aspire to. And I think we forget all that. And this evening, if some of you are going to Mr. Romano's presentation, he does make that connect between values and measurement. It's critically important. And if we think we don't have an agenda, well, we can all go home. There is an agenda. We are, I think, trying to move ourselves forward in a sustainable manner, get rid of the things that really move us in the wrong direction. So what does the report say? What we measure affects what we do, and if our measurements are flawed, and I would make the argument that they are flawed because we're not looking at the full array of what constitutes well-being and progress and sustainability, then our decisions are distorted. And I think a lot of what we talked about this morning was related to that, is narrow analysis, and then we make decisions that are not fully understood or fully comprehending the issues. And what we measure shapes what we collectively strive to pursue, and what we pursue determines what we measure. And that's all the values and the pursuit of what we're trying to achieve. This is very quick, just to give you a sense. This is the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. It's an array of 8 areas of well-being, which includes the environment. On the right-hand side, you'll see our report release, and we've done a number of releases. So at the end of this full array is the development of a composite, which would integrate all areas of well-being into a single number. So there's 2 things I want to say here in terms of messaging and communication. It isn't a precise mathematical equation, period. It is a window on a full array of greater understanding. So when you look at a single number, it's a communication tool to draw your attention to those full array of well-being indicators so that you can then drill down into what does it mean and what is the connectivity between those. And this is what we're really trying to achieve, is the connectivity between all 8. And if you look at it, it is intuitive. You know, the environment does relate to our health. Use of our time does relate to our living standards. All those connectivities, but we don't measure it. It's measured in silos, and it's measured in different parts of our sectors and never fully integrated. So that's the purpose of the composite at one level, and also the potential for the integration of these things in a trend line. And you'll see that for those who are going this afternoon to Alex's presentation. I put this up, if you can read it. I was talking to Mr. Romano, who was here for Scott Vaughan's speech, and you know, one of the things he said is you've got to appeal to people's emotions. You know, the intuitive nature of what you know, spending a lot of time with great words, sometimes this gets to you where you want to be pretty quickly. And that's really what we're trying to address in communicating the index. If you don't have the array, chances are you're going to run into that mountain. And we certainly did in September 2008. This is just to give you a quick view. This is an effort to succinct 10 years of effort here in terms of why we are developing a new measure of well-being. So I've really highlighted it's a promotion of a shared vision towards well-being and sustainability, measuring a national progress towards or away from well-being, stimulate discussion. And that one is sort of my little bugbear. It's around how to stimulate, how to have the dialogue, how to have that conversation with new words, intersectorally discussing the relationship between health and the environment, between time use and living standards, between education, lifelong learning, and other aspects of well-being. Give Canadian tools. One of the things I've been working with is trying to figure out how you have that conversation so Canadians can actually ask the right questions. And I think someone said that earlier. It's more asking about the right questions and what those questions look like rather than the answers. And then also add momentum to the global movement, which you all know about. I'm putting this up as an example of some of the things you need to do when you're communicating your message. This is our advisory board. I'm showing it only as an example of when you start to communicate your message or the development of your work, you have to have champions. You have to have leaders, preferably outside the box, outside the usual suspects. And some of those names you will recognize are people who are not particularly noted for their area of expertise like in health or a particular area of statistician. But what we've done is a mix of champions so that they are available to us to support and advance the work. And we've got obviously Mr. Romano, Monique Bégin, and then there's a number of people that you will recognize there, all the way down to Marilyn Waring, who is the time use expert out of the University of Auckland. And on our right-hand side, the connection again. This is a global effort, and it's really important to make that connection and have some kind of way of engaging the international network. People are really excited about what we're doing, really excited about the potential here, and are willing to sign on and be part of it. So I'm using just this as an example of sharing your leadership as a success point of view. Again, on the other side is just a visual showing the breadth, and I'm getting it as an example of how you need to show very quickly. So we've got engagement of academics, NGOs, and government folks from all the way from Nova Scotia to BC. And I emphasize the fact that I think in any sustainable development, and I think CSUN and IISD do a good job with this as well, is the intersectoral mix that you've got to do. Nothing moves forward in one sector. You have to have stakeholders and you have to have partnership relationships, or you will not be able to communicate your message. You will not be able to communicate what you're doing without that kind of broad context. How are we doing, Michael? Good. So real quick, this is just an illustration of the CIW, and I'm not going to devote a lot of attention to it. It's really showing the CIW up into 2008 in relationship to GDP. Hans and Alex are going to talk about this more this afternoon. But again, it's a window or a tool to begin to have that conversation about the integration between all 8 areas of well-being that includes the environment. I want to say a little bit about the public consultation process, insofar as we happen to think that this is one of the greatest ways to communicate your message, and this is a way of engaging the public. It's a chart showing a number of points of intervention, and when I was thinking about the development of my presentation today, I guess the key messages here are a couple of things. One is you have to define, we all talk about public engagement, but do we define it? And it's really critical to define it. You can't engage people without having them understand how are you going to use their engagement, how you're going to use the information, and also work that out. It's a reciprocity opportunity to have them participate in that. Really critical. This has been pivotal to our effort, because now we have people across Canada who are our spokespeople, who are working and using the Index of Wellbeing at ground level, can apply it, can engage it, be ready at the moment to articulate the effort that we're doing. Really important to do this, and we've done it 3 times across over a number of years. The other point I want to make is that we built the engagement with their investment. So we didn't come and say, this is what we'd like you to do and this is what we want from you. We approached them as a valued stakeholder in the experience. So we asked them to identify how they might. Did we have the right questions? Did we have the right process? Was there anything that they wanted to do or change around the implementation? So at the end of the day, the public owned it. The public understood their place in the effort. And I think it's going to bode well as we continue to roll out our release. Just a very quick slide to show you what we have learned in our experiences is communicating complex information. What we've done, and I do have some examples here in hard copy, but be very happy to send it to you electronically, is out of the technical reports that we've done, and many of them are very long and lots of very valuable information about our well-being indicator sets, but we've actually developed report highlights. So it's easy to understand, it's in plain language, and it's easily digestible by for government, for the public, for the media. So at quick glance, we've identified the key messages that we want to get across, that people can drill down into the technical report and have that conversation. We also have an executive summary where all the technical reports, again, are standalone, very useful in terms of media packages, public briefing documents, government briefing documents for people to see quickly. This is nothing that you don't already know, is to try to establish the key messages for a media release. So it's the story you want to tell, not the story that the reporter wants to hear. So you really identify that, and Michael talked about that earlier, is to figure out your communication strategy so it's very clear and that all your spokespeople are on the same page so that you're recreating the same key messages over and over again. Why? Because you're in charge of your message, number one, and number two, it also is a point of reference for that drilling down with a media person, with a government person in terms of thinking through what the full array. It's also creating an opportunity for dialogue, which is really what you're trying to achieve. We also spend a lot of time, I've talked about key messages, is the question and answer. It's really thinking through what's missing, what is the scope of what you've got offered to you, and try to identify those questions that might come at you from a briefing, a government person, from media, from the public, from whoever you're trying to create the dialogue with, so that you actually are preempting some of the challenges that you have. And being very transparent about some of the things you have or have not done. Also, we've really done a lot of work with trying to create opportunities with media to identify things that are going on in the media where we can actually respond with op-editorials, with media blogs, with partners who are actually talking about some of the same things. Creating and finding ways where you can actually keep the conversation going, keep the dialogue going. I'm going to say a couple of things. One is for all, these are my key points around public engagement, media, and government. Build a relationship. It's really important. Try to establish the relationship. Also, before you do that, identify your role and what the other party's role is. I think we get into a great deal of difficulty when we don't understand each other's role in the mix. And then once you understand the role, you can have that dialogue and try to build bridges to create an opportunity to advance the discussion. I think the last point I want to make is, and it was said a couple of times this morning, is that we seem to, and this is something that we're challenged with, is how to identify the research and the science of it, and then find case studies or applications that really work. And often what happens in these situations, you might find a place where you can actually use the indicator sets, build an application or a case story, and then you get the yes but. So it's trying to identify how you tell that replication story or that pilot story so that it actually can be replicated and developed over time. One of the examples I want to make is some work that we're doing in Simcoe, Muskoka here in Ontario, where a consortium of environmental, health, social service people are actually using the CIW framework to do their social planning. So they're taking our national index, even though we're not completely finished, and spending resources in terms of identifying and figuring out how they can do sustainable planning in their community. I use that as an example because that's one that could be replicated other places, and yet we've got to figure out how you share that information in a way that can be replicated and eliminate the yes but that we all seem to go to on occasion when we can't see the vision beyond that.
I'm happy to be here. My name's Stephen Leahy, and I am an environmental journalist, which is a pretty rare breed these days. So why am I here? I am here to help you solve some of your communication problems. I've been a journalist for the last 16 years, covering mostly environment, sustainability, and development. The last few years on a global basis. So, as Michael mentioned, I just came back from Seychelles Islands covering a fisheries conference on how we're going to have tuna and other important food sources for the future. Before I started my career as a journalist, I spent 10 years in the corporate sector. I was a marketing director of a couple of big corporations, and for a little while I was one of the junk mail kings of Canada, turning out millions and millions of pieces of junk mail until I saw the light. So what I want to do is talk about the current state of the media, some new tools for communication, and maybe some tips. But to give you an idea, or maybe to start things off, I'll start off with telling you a story. And it's a true story. So I was in this bar, and this is a true story. I was in this bar not that long ago, and the guy beside me somehow brings up climate change, saying this is, Al Gore's fantasy has now gone bust, and this is a complete hoax, and so on and so forth. And I go, well, as it turns out, I am actually somebody who knows something about climate change, having interviewed hundreds of scientists all over the world, read hundreds of climate studies, been to the big climate conferences, so on and so forth. And it seems to me, I said to this guy, that, I think these guys are right. There is something called climate change. And he goes, oh, no, those guys are all in it for the money. They're all part of some conspiracy, and so forth. And I go, okay, well, I've also been lucky enough to go to places where I've seen the glaciers, where they've been melting. I've been in the high Arctic to see the thinning of the ice. I've been to various other places to see with my own eyes climate change. And I've talked to people who live in these places, indigenous people who've been there for 1,000 years. They see these changes happening. And the guy says, yeah, well, that's your opinion. So this has actually been this is a major issue in communication these days. So finally, my last desperate attempt to try to get through to this guy, I said, okay, let's say I ask you to drive me home. And it's along a road that you've never driven before. And it's dark and it's foggy out tonight. And I say, okay, you better slow down. There's a curve coming up ahead. And you say to me, I don't see a curve. I don't see any reason to slow down. I said, this is what you're saying about climate change. This is exactly an analogy. I have the expertise because I live along this road. I'm advising you that for safety's sake, let's slow down. And then you reject that on the basis of it could be my opinion. So there's a difference between informed opinion and opinion. But we're in this strange time where people don't believe facts anymore. They think everything is opinion. And this is making the communication challenge very difficult for all of you, including me. The other part of the media story is the media is not what it used to be. There's been 20,000 layoffs in the U.S. Media in the last 2 years. There's hardly any science and environmental reporters left. I think even in big publications like the New York Times, they're struggling financially. They're cutting back the number of pages they're covering on science and environment issues. Same is happening in Canada. And this is making it all the more challenging for people like you to get your message out. You can't rely on media like you were once able to. So one of the pointers, as Lynne mentioned, is forming relationships. Well, it's difficult to form relationships with people in media when they're gone. So it's an ongoing process. You can't just have your favorite reporter who actually understands what you're talking about. You have to continue to cultivate that because the chances are that person's not going to be around. I was at a science award ceremony last year for the AAAS, and 4 out of the 5 winners of these best science writing of the year didn't have jobs anymore. So that's the current state. The other part of this is we have this unbelievable explosion of information, quote unquote, in the internet, in blog sites and fake news websites. So the communication challenge has gotten more and more challenging because it's easier for people to put up confusing messages. So I think it's incumbent upon anyone these days is to, you have to be open, honest, and direct about what you're trying to say and what you're trying to accomplish. And you need to continually work on improving your messaging. Continually find other ways to work with people to be clear and direct. Some of those new tools like Facebook and Twitter, definitely you have to use those because those are the communication tools that people are using more and more. You ask a young person, where do you get your news from? And if they can even answer the question, so sometimes they say, well, what is news? They'll say, I get it from YouTube or Jon Stewart's Daily Show. So that's the reality. So you have to learn to work with that. So really what I want to do is answer your question. So I'll end up with a couple of tips on communication. Of course, you have to know your audience, and that's more difficult because we now have a much more fragmented audience of people who never listen to TV news and people who don't read newspapers. So that's really important. You have to know who you're trying to communicate to. You have to answer the so what question, as Lynne said. People are very busy and everyone's suffering from information overload. So you have to make it relevant to them. And of course, your communications has to be jargon-free. You have to be able to explain the word sustainability. You know, this is a key thing that isn't done nearly enough. What does it mean and what does it mean for me as an individual? Use metaphors, use examples, tell stories just like I did. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I would like to focus my presentation this time, to avoid repeating myself, on really the reporting process itself, and not that much the process, but the reports. So what we are talking about. I will focus again more on what I know, so what's going on in the private sector, even though if, as you will see here, there will be a link to how also governments are reporting on their own sustainability agenda. So, of course, one of the key aspects of sustainability is to find a way to report on what is going on in your organization. And it's always interesting to see that I heard a couple of times today what is sustainability. When you read those reports, you have real concrete example of what it means and what it is to move toward a sustainable part. And I'm happy that Stephen has mentioned that you have to tell stories. I mentioned that in my presentation this morning. The most exciting report, and they can be quite exciting, are the one which tell a story. And it's often amazing to see how a company has moved toward a sustainable path. But before I get into more the detail of the communication aspect of sustainability, Just look at how things are evolving and evolving rapidly. This is some information that I picked from Corporate Register. Just for you to know, it used to be a free website. Now you have to pay for it. But there's a lot of very useful information through Corporate Register, as you can also find through the Global Reporting Initiative. So you see these reports growing. I have given you examples of how the government used to produce their report. I'm not trying to say that they were boring like hell. I hope that the new one will become a little bit more interesting, because obviously when it comes to communication, they have forgotten to look at their reporting process with the lens of good communicators. And companies are a good example as you look at what they are doing. I mentioned the province of Quebec. I have to say that they have probably evolved from what the federal strategy were and look like, and they have come with something which has been a little bit more jazzy. One of the reasons why you have so many reports now is basically because in Europe there are some regulation forcing you to come with a report. And we think that this is new, but it's interesting also to know that, for example, in the banking sector, or the investment sector, the Bank Act asks the companies to report on, they didn't use at the time the word sustainability, but still to report on the social aspect. And you will see often, not in sustainability report necessarily, but you will often see in the, as I mentioned up, the MD&A stands for Management, Disclosure, and Analysis, if I'm right. Correct me, Nelson, right? It's a portion of the annual report of a public company which has to address the risks of the company. And often, even if a company doesn't have a sustainability report, you may find a lot of information there. What is interesting, too, is that you may, if you look at these different ways to report on different aspects of sustainability, you will discover that they are not telling the same story. So you can have a latest information in a sustainability report, and you go on the website of the company, and you have a totally different story because they have forgotten to update their environmental information, and you still have the policy of 96 and 97. So it's one thing that companies will have to do more and more, make sure that all these mechanisms to report on what they are doing are aligned and are telling the same story. What you see in those reports, I didn't talk too much about that this morning, but you are supposed to cover somehow the universe. And I have given you a couple of examples here, some that I talked about earlier this morning. But it's one thing which is very interesting to me is that even private company, if you look at the pulp and paper and the forestry sector, they are almost all public companies, with few exceptions, Kruger being one. It's a private company. But because of the pressure of the peers, they don't have any kind of obligation whatsoever to come with a sustainability report. But because of the pressure of the peers, they have decided to go along the same way. And you will see that more and more happening with companies which are not public companies. So they have, as I mentioned, to cover all these aspects. Now, we have to ask ourselves, who reads those documents? And I have looked a little bit, me first. That's my living, so it's a different story. But we have done a little bit of research within my group to prepare for this presentation. And the information that we were able to get came from the Global Reporting Initiative, and I will just read it for you. About 60% of readers are in business, and the rest are mainly consultants and government employees. You have 25% of that group which are prospective customers or suppliers, And one of the reasons why they are there is that they want to know what companies that they are selling product to are doing, and how they can come with a marketing strategy to position themselves. And I will give you a few examples later, my own examples. And 60% of readers use sustainability reports to help themselves benchmark the reporter's overall performance. So it has become a way to, do we say spy? To spy what your competitors are doing. And you will see later why GI is really becoming their reference, even though if it's not the perfect tool, but it will become, in the coming years, and it had happened already, the way to compare information among a sector of the industry. So who's reading these reports? I gave you an idea, but in more concrete terms, why stakeholders will read these reports. First of all, and I will invite you at some point, if you're curious about all this aspect of reporting, to look at the report of Ethical Funds. Ethical Funds is an investor, and they have been able to force their investee, I guess we call it, to really move on a sustainable path. And the way that they have designed their report, it's very interesting. They come with a list of what are the issues that they have an interest in, biodiversity, climate change, and other stuff. And they tackle companies in which they have invested, and then they will start having a dialogue with those companies. And they will say, we would like you to move a little bit more in this area, do this, do that. And once a year, they come with a report. And then you have, imagine, shareholders and CEOs of companies. You have your name in the report. Let's say, I'll take an example of one that is there, Barrick Gold. So you have the name of Barrick Gold, and you have what Ethical Fund is expecting from Barrick Gold. And then, guess what? If you don't do right, the year after, they won't leave you alone. The year after, they will have another dialogue with you. They will ask you, what have you done and what you have not? And they will report back. So it's almost becoming a kind of auditing mechanism with no mandatory framework of any sort. They are just pushing you. And I mean, believe me, when a company this report gets out and the company sees what is the story about itself, not coming from an ONG or an NGO, but coming from an investor, it has a huge impact. So the way that reports now are written, and it's the same thing for CDP, as an example, the Carbon Disclosure Project, you have your name, and in Quebec, I cannot speak for other provinces, but in Quebec, when the CDP report is launched, you can be sure that there will be a headline on the newspaper, not talking about the good guys, who are the ones who didn't respond to the Carbon Disclosure Project. So you have more and more to be careful, not only about what you report with respect to your own company, but also looking at what others are telling about your company in their own report. And all the investment company, I talked about the ethical funds, but you can also look in Quebec at Bâtirente, Caisse de dépôt, will more and more become vocal to put some more pressure on companies to move on a sustainable path. So you have the shareholders on the one hand, you have the suppliers, and that's interesting because if you want to better position yourself, you're a supplier of socks, let's say, and you sell to Walmart. You want to understand, you want to be first in line in terms of understanding what Walmart is expecting from you as a supplier. So you go and read their report, and you know exactly what they are looking for, because if you want to differentiate yourself, you have to be first, because there will come a time where everybody will be on the same page, so you no longer have this aspect to differentiate yourself from the others. So you go and look at these reports and see how you can better position yourself. And just to give you a very interesting story, as we speak, at least in Quebec, and I know it's the case also in Ontario, the liquor boards are trying to move more on a sustainable path. They are looking at transportation, they are looking at packaging, they are also looking at green products. If you sell wine, you are a wine distributor, of course you would like to increase your product offering to the liquor board. If you don't know that it is written somewhere in the sustainability report of the Quebec Liquor Board, as an example, that they intend to expand their green offering, so fair trade wine or organic wine or whatsoever, you don't know and you don't have that advantage to position yourself with your product. So more and more companies will start looking at these reports to see how to better position themselves and build a relationship, because at the end of the day, this is what they are looking at too, not only increase their profit, but to build a relationship. If you want to improve your energy efficiency, you will look for suppliers who have something to offer. I mean, you can make 25 phone calls, and you can have an hour discussion with all of these people. If I have something to offer which is environmentally friendly, I should have something to communicate and having a good document to communicate so that I can start saying more things about what we are doing as a company. Now, there's different ways to communicate, and there are different informations that people are looking at. And one of the things in terms of communicating information that companies are doing more and more is, and I have a hard time with this word, is to customize their information. So for example, if you go and see what Starbucks is doing, depending on the nature of the information you're looking for, you can really, there's different layers, and you can get all kind of information. I'm not even sure if they still have a hard copy report. I think everything is on the web. So one thing is through helping people to navigate on their website to get information. So that's one thing. And also to increase the accessibility. It's interesting to see that reports for multinational, for example, are now available in many languages. So that gives you a little bit of a portrait of who is looking at that. And one last thing I would like to mention. I don't know how many of you go through hiring process. We do that quite often. And it's interesting to know that the X and Y generation will have a look at your sustainability report before they go on interview. And if you're not aware yourself about the fact that you have a sustainability report, you may be surprised because they will ask you questions, because they will have look at the report also themselves. And I was talking this morning about the Ulsan and all the companies which are there. I mean, if I'm a young professional and I'm looking for a job, they all give me the same salary, they all give me the same condition, I will go for the one probably which seems to be the most sustainable one because it's not because they are working in this resource sector that they don't try to move hard on a sustainable path. To the contrary, in some cases, but I will also probably base, and we did some analysis on that, base my decision on the most sustainable one. So again, in the context of rareté in terms of attracting and retain talented people, this is also, and that has been proven, I see somebody just saying yes, has been proven to be also a way to communicate who you are and what are your values, because it's often about values. So let me tell you just a little bit. Do I have 5 more minutes? On my own experience, Lynne was saying that she's a social worker. I'm an environmentalist by training, so I have a bias. And this is not the Deloitte girl speaking, neither the former public servant. Really me, when I read a report, what I'm looking for. So a couple of things. First of all, and Stephen mentioned that, I'm looking for a story. I mentioned that a couple of times. But what is a story for me? A story is certainly a report which has, in French we will say un fil conducteur, probably a trend, that you can follow what somebody is trying to tell you. And of course, I want to know what is the vision of the company. So I'm not only looking for facts, I'm looking at you, at your report, as the image of the company to know what are you trying to achieve? Who are you? And what is important? What are your values? So that's the first thing that I'm looking for in the story. The other thing is the challenges that you are facing. So somehow the fairness of your report, and this is certainly the poor cousin. You will have the good guys telling all their good stories. And it seems when you read these reports that they never have challenges. They never have problems. I mean, it's surprising when you look at the issues that they have to face. And here, a good example that I will give you is Kimberly-Clark, and the other one is the Danone one. And I will get back to Danone for the reasons later. They, in the front page, when the CEO talks about sustainability, guess what? He's also talking about the problems, the issues, the constraints, the barriers that he has to go through. Don't you think that it gives a little bit more credibility to your report instead of just talking about all the good things that you are doing? So it has to be balanced, and you have to be able to communicate what are the issues that you are struggling with. The relevance, I talked about that this morning. Let's think for a second about gaming. We all have in each province our gaming crown. Some are doing great things in the area of environment, but will you expect that if you read one of those sustainability reports in this area in particular, that they will address problems related to suicide, to addiction? You will expect to, right? Go and try to find out that kind of information. That doesn't exist. So it has to be material. It has to do with the core business of an organization. I talked about the mining sector this morning. It's similar to the gaming one. So again, it's about building trust, building the relationship between the stakeholder and the companies. And in a report, you are expecting relevance, fairness, and comparability to a large extent. You want to be able to compare apples with apples. So GRI, for that purpose, as I mentioned, is a good way to go. A CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, also is a good way so that you can compare companies with respect to their greenhouse gas reduction performance. Interactivity, Stephen mentioned, and I will get back to that in a second, about the new social media. Your report shouldn't be static. There should be a way to engage stakeholders in, giving their views with respect to your report. What do they think about it? How they can see improvement? You should also do consultation to make sure that your report responds to what stakeholders are expecting. So again, making sure that what you will talk about is something that is of meaningfulness for your stakeholders. And finally, accountability. So beyond the story, what I'm looking in a report is some kind of vision, some objectives, actions in terms of how I'm going to get there, really. So who I am, what I'm doing, where I'm going, and how I'm going to get there. And a good foundation, I will say, to make sure that I can rely on the information that is given to me. So a good measurement so that I can know if you're moving in the right direction or not. So basically, this is what I personally look at when I think of a good report. Now, let me just give you an example. We talked this morning about, somebody asked me the question, what is a good report, and what is the nature of the information that should be given. I like the Bombardier example, and I will tell you a little bit of a story. When I started at Deloitte, it was like at this time of the year 3 years ago, and the first my first ever shareholder annual meeting that I attended was Bombardier. So that was early 2007. There's 3 guys who went to the mic. The first one asked Bombardier, and you can see they started in 2007. So there was nothing before at the shareholder meeting. So the first guy said, can you tell me, Mr. Baudouin, the CEO and chairman of the board were there, can you tell me what is your human rights policy considering that you're doing business in Tibet? So Mr. Baudouin said, thank you for the question. Next came and he asked, what is your greenhouse gas reduction strategy? Because they are in the transportation sector and the aerospace sector. He looked around and said, I'll take note, I'll get back to you. And then the third guy, and that was not, organized at all. I mean, 3 guys who were having a question. And the third one said, how come a multinational like yours doesn't have a sustainability report? I can tell you, this guy would have talked in Chinese that probably he would have understood better. So he said, thank you very much. I take good note. The only commitment I will make at this stage is that next year I will get back to you on these questions. And then came, as you can imagine, a meeting at the highest level. And he asked, I'm assuming here, I wasn't there, what this is all about. And then somebody said, because she was a friend of mine, she's still a friend of mine, but she's no longer working there. She said, these are the kind of things that we were trying to put on the board agenda and on the executive group agenda, which we've never been able to do. So this is what this is all about. So what they have decided to do is, in a very humble way, the first year, so by the end of that year, so 6 months later, they have come with what they have called a roadmap. Essentially, they have said, this is where we are, this is what we have done so far, and this is where we would like to be. A kind of vision statement, let's say it that way. The year after, so during the next 12 months, they have really worked hard in getting the number, have a good understanding of where they would like to be. So they built their own strategy, and they came with their first report last year, which is a very well done report with all the attributes that you're looking for a good report. And this year, they have come with a kind of wrap-up of what is meaningful for their stakeholders. And one thing that they have achieved, which is quite interesting, and this is a point that I would like to make, we heard this morning about the Millennium Development Goal. We have the Global Compact. We have this, we have that. And very rarely, companies will link what they are doing with these things, which are crucial things that we have to take into account, right? And in this case, what they have done is really take the Global Compact, which are principles, basically, and they have linked those principles to real concrete action that they are doing. So you have a totally different perspective on what the company is doing when you come with this kind of context piece with respect to what you're trying to achieve. So for me, this is a very, very good example of how you bring your stakeholder and how you move along on the sustainable journey in terms of reporting process. Just to conclude, and I will I guess it's my turn to get you involved and not asking questions, but giving your views on these new social media that I'm too old, I guess, now to really understand. But in my house, it's all over the place. TV is almost a kind of, when my kids were asking me, were you able to see black and white TV? I said, yes, of course. But now it's the color TV, and I feel, again, like a dinosaur compared to these new social media. But just before we go there, and I would like to hear your view on that, never underestimate the risks related to going public with a report. You, and I will never give enough this advice to anybody. When you start getting there, be sure that you are on a safe ground. Because if what you are saying is not well supported, you will end up yourself or your company representative in front of an audience. And they won't be able to answer questions, and it will be even more embarrassing because you will have made commitments and public statement related to what you want to do. And be sure, because often, and I have seen that many times, companies will start with a report, and then it will try to figure out how to build a strategy to match the report. It should be the other way around. You start with a strategy, and when you're on safe ground, you know what you're talking about, you know where you're going, then you start slowly reporting on things. And believe it or not, and I'm sure you will believe me, there are many companies that issued a report, a sustainability report, which has not been vetted by the board, if it's a public company, or by the executive group. You could be surprised what your people are saying about your company. So make sure that you are on very solid ground. And the last thing that I would like to say, and this is very interesting. I was doing some work for a client not too long ago. And, you know, we were asking questions about health and safety. And everything was perfect under the sun. At one point, we talked with one of the staff. And that person says, thank God not to me because I wouldn't have known what to do with that. She said, you know, there's a blog on our company and all the burnout and all the fatigue of the employees. And I said, okay. So I asked one of my kids to have a quick look at that and try to figure out where we can get that information. And then I asked my staff, you know, dig out a little bit so that we will know what's going on. It was just amazing. When we mentioned to the CEO that all around on Facebook, Twitter, and others, don't ask me, they were all chatting about, you know, workforce condition in the company, I couldn't believe that. So these media or social media are really becoming a part of what you do and how you breathe, and mostly the bad thing, not always the good thing that we would like to see there. And for me, it's almost the extension of whatever reporting process that you have. So you better have a way to communicate with your stakeholders to make sure that these things at least will convey the right message, than not having that dialogue, which will take place anyway. So be aware, look at that. For me, I mean, I'm too old. That was a surprise to me, so maybe it's time to retire. But more and more, these are the kind of network which will be used to communicate in terms of what is going on in the area of sustainability. And if you have followed a little bit some companies in Canada in the mining industry, you will see that in no time, you know what's going on deep, deep, deep south in Africa or in South America through those social media. And Stephen, you must see that very, very often. So I stopped there, and I would be more than happy to hear from you. I mean, what these new social media means for the younger generation.
We started thinking about developing a system about a year or two ago where we would complement indicators, which is very quantitative and supposed to be objective, with stories. Thinking about, you know, it's the left brain, right brain. You want to capture people in both groups. So we are in the middle of doing, we call that Story Garden. But one thing that is becoming clear, and I'm getting the same, I think, from your discussions, that, you know, as we start, you know, looking more at stories, and stories are powerful. How do you ensure quality control? There are, when you look at indicators and data, we always put a lot of emphasis on making sure that it's objective, it's measurable, it's in a sense you can't question the validity. When you talk about stories, and I think stories are important, but quality and truth and so on has a very different meaning. How do you ensure that? And especially as we look at new social media, as you were making the point, the qualified environmental journalists are becoming an endangered species in a sense, but we have a lot of tweets and so on. It's a lot of information, but where is quality? So I think that's a real issue, and I just would like to hear your opinion on this, particularly as it is related to metrics, because I think we are going in that direction where we are trying to reach out to more people with our metrics through stories. So how do we ensure quality? That's going to be a critical question, I think.
We have to be careful. Telling a story is one way to communicate something. It doesn't mean that you don't need the foundation behind whatever you will tell as your story.
I'm probably in the same category as Joanna, related to all these new social media things. Just a story that we just experienced and trying to get something in the paper on the democratic deficit in Canada. So we tried everything. We didn't make it to the print media, but we did check out a new social media opportunity called Mark News, which is an opinion piece that's growing. We checked it out. So my point is, you've got no control over these blogs, period. Forget it. Don't even bother. But what you can do is build a relationship with those who you consider credible. And you just do your due diligence and make sure that those who you hook up with. My understanding of what do you call the hits, Stephen? Help me here. Is, even though there's blogs galore, those who don't get hit, 500,000 a day die because their opinions don't matter. So you have some control over building capacity and the story and the quality through relationships with those who are really sound, who care about, facts, who care about evidence-based storytelling, and who care about putting out a point of view that's balanced.
I'd like to have both. Obviously, I want to have statistics to back up whatever story someone is trying to pitch me. And so that's a crucial part. Quality control on the internet is a definite huge issue, and I would say, train your children well to be able to read and understand the wheat from the chaff, because it is a huge problem and it's difficult to control. So from an organization's point of view, you've got to be consistent, you have to have evidence, you have to have links so people could go deeper, and you've got to respond to the comments. I mean, I hate all the crappy junk mail I got to respond to from people who are saying that I'm whatever, about climate change stories. So, but you got to do it, because it just gets out of control and it needs to have that feedback. So this door has already been opened, so this is the reality we're in. So.
Hi, my name is Tim. I'm with Strategic Sustainable Investments. So I come at it from a bit more of an economics or financial perspective. I really just, to touch on your comment, I think that both sides are important. I would say where you relate that information is probably more crucial. If you're talking about grassroots and people who relate more to the storytelling, I think that commercials, I think that sections on your website are really important, trying to keep things brief. I think when it comes to a sustainability report, trying to analyze companies, the last thing I want to see is a 200-page sustainability report full of stories. That's where I want the data. So I think that where you put the information is probably, a much easier way, because understanding where people go. In terms of this whole sort of social media aspect, because I think it's absolutely fascinating, I guess I would just say that it's really, it's a guess right now at kind of how this stuff is going to play out. And so I would say, have someone watching it, things like RSS feeds and Google alerts, so you can type in any word and create a Google alert, and you'll get an email once a day or once a week with anything that comes up that has that word. I think you really have to monitor it. But I would say that's, where pilot projects are going to be huge, and monitor it and then kind of see where it goes from there. And just kind of the final point is more relating sort of to the climate change, because that's something that I've really had to face. I came up and I learned climate science, and, I understand that this is what's happening. But, a great example is that I had dinner with a fellow a couple weeks ago, probably one of the 10 richest guys in Canada. And he doesn't even have a cell phone. He sits on the board of probably half a dozen different companies, and he thinks climate change is the biggest hoax. Now, the way that I get through that is not by convincing, and I love the stories and I love whatever, but I don't talk about carbon. I talk about energy. And, if I can talk to him about a way that he can reduce the percentage of energy costs of the overall costs, right? If you can reduce energy per unit sold, then that's speaking his language. It's the same thing as reducing CO2 emissions per unit sold, but one he's going to listen to, the other one he isn't going to. So I really want to stress, know your audience. And when it comes to financial people, it's really simple. Business people care about money. Politicians care about jobs. And everybody else cares about, the basic things that you talked about, which is their health, their family, their income. And so understand who your audience is and sort of who can. So I guess that was more of a comment than a question, but just kind of wanted to throw it out.
Good comment.
I have a client who is in the coffee business, and they are going through a serious sustainability kind of approach. And a couple of people from the company went to Honduras because they wanted to establish a relationship with some fair trade producer, okay? They want from day one to involve their employees. They have opened up a blog for the duration of their trip. There's 2,000 employees. There were on average 500 people per day just following what was going on. How much does it worth to get the buy-in of your employees and get them involved, and when you think for a second that they are your ambassadors? They are the one who will talk in good terms or in bad terms about your company. So we have to look at who we're trying to reach, and also make sure, and I don't want to be misread in the sense that a story can be a very good scientific story. When Stephen writes an article, it's science-based, but still there's a way to tell a story to get people involved, and it's amazing. I was reading their blog last week, and I was just saying to myself, you have to be real, you have to be passionate to take the time to write something like that. This is not greenwashing. This is me talking to you about things that I'm seeing that are happening, and I think we can make a difference. And this, for sure, is something that we shouldn't put aside because, and I agree with you, we don't control what is there, but still, there are so many fascinating stories that are happening as we speak.
This goes back to the know your audience thing, but there were 2 points. One, I think the term we were all looking for was the golden thread. The story is not the 200-page report. The story is the tagline, is the eco-imagination, the plan A. That's the story, I think, that resonates more with people. And so I think as somebody who writes sustainability reports, that's where I try to focus that energy, is try to find what is the consistent theme that I can put in this report that's going to resonate with the greatest number of stakeholders. And ask myself the question, who are those stakeholders, and what is the common theme that's going to speak to all of them? It's always difficult to determine. I completely agree with you with regard to the financial comments. But there was 2 other things. One, you have to anticipate the trend. Controlling social media, as a matter of fact, I'm often in on conversations where people say, how are we going to control social media? Well, that's a fantasy and a half. So there's no such thing as controlling social media, but you can certainly influence the conversation by interjection and by response. Interactive social media is something you can manage. How you interact with it, but not necessarily what you're going to get back. The other question I would say on there is ask yourself who you are. If this is speaking from within an organization. Are you an influencer or are you an operationalizer? Are you responsible for actually making the changes within the organization, or do you have the task, the heady task of influencing those who will make the changes? Because that's the biggest story I think that most people miss, right? What is it that you as an and you touched on it really well with Bombardier, great example of an organization that took it from the beginning. We have no idea what we're doing, and we're letting you know that. But what we do know is that there's a journey that we'd like to get on that train, no pun intended, and move along that path, right? So I just wanted to put those out there as comments.
One of the things I just wanted to say is we tend to, and maybe that's why I'm picking up on it, think that the story and the evidence is a different story. They're all part of the same equation. I also want to pick up on something Joanna said, is that at some level we only move when we feel it. It's not always what's in our heads. So Joanna's point about passion and identifying in that evidence-based story, whatever story you're telling, get passionate, get excited about the one thing that excites you the most. That's what moves me, and I think it moves other people. Again, it's all evidence-based, so know your audience, yes, but it's your story, and you have to get it out with excitement.
More about is curiosity. If you have ever, as a marketing background that I have, like, and as you mentioned during your speech, you should be adapting your speech to whoever audience you're targeting. And I see that when companies are developing their financial reports, they have one clear target, they are investors. But when you're developing or producing your sustainability report, you have like many different people that are going to be looking at that, NGOs, government, civil society, anyone. And I see, well, at least most of the companies that I've been looking sustainability reports, they build one sustainability report to englobe everyone. And Nelson just mentioned that he tries to talk to everyone and in the same document. Have you ever seen a sustainability report like that targets specific groups or not? And do you believe that this could be something important to think about?
Just one, I can't resist picking up on this. I think there is a fundamental message. Which of those images are your eyes more attracted to? Okay, exactly. The human face. When I studied journalism some years ago, they showed us successful journalism enterprises, and one they held up a copy of Time magazine, and they said, "Why is this the most successful news magazine in the year?" Everybody started looking. What's on it? Always on it is a human face, with almost no exceptions. A few exceptions: a robot, the planet Earth. Those are probably maybe one per decade. So just keep that in mind, going back to Laszlo's point about the storytelling. Always remember, because a lot of you people are technically oriented, and you work in numbers, you live in numbers. So if you can't do it, try to find people who can help you carry the story and put the human face on it. That will be the key to your success with all the audiences that you are wrestling with. I guarantee it. It will be the way in the doorway. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for all their expertise and time.